Welcome to The Imperfect Activist, a new podcast on the Be the Change Media Network.
The Imperfect Activist talks all things youth activism, advocacy, and change-making. We address some of the most pressing environmental and social issues while reconciling with the challenges that come with growing up and transitioning into adulthood.
We shed light and face head-on the hot takes of youth activism and climate organising that are uncomfortable to discuss. This podcast will be a brave space where uncomfortable truths are learned and tricky questions are debated.
Because to become stronger, more united and more efficient as a demographic, we need to figure out what real solidarity looks like before we move forward to confront other societal issues with the urgency that is needed.
The Imperfect Activist follows the belief that we don't need 100 perfect activists, but millions of imperfect ones. Famous words by youth activist and environmentalist Clover Hogan. Meet your hosts.
I'm Lucy.
I'm Annabelle.
I'm Natasha, and we're excited to talk all things activism and organising with you, chatting with young changemakers from across the globe.
We don't need 100 perfect activists, but millions of imperfect ones.
Young people, well, we're the future. We've got everything to fight for.
Hello, I'm Annabelle. Welcome to today's episode. Today, we're talking about what it means to stand for justice in all of its forms, from climate to Palestine to Congo and Sudan. A lot of youth activists are realizing that our struggles are deeply connected and that silence isn't an option. We're going to be talking about what community organizing looks like when you're feeling helpless, what it means to take arrestable action, and why voices like Greta's and so many others aren't getting the same media attention once they began speaking up for global liberation movements. This conversation is about solidarity, accountability, and what it means to show up, even when it's uncomfortable.
So, let's have a conversation about Palestine and, where we're coming from and thoughts, feelings from a local level. And as young people and youth activists, change makers from across the globe, what are our thoughts on the moment on the current genocide going on in Palestine? I think it'll be really interesting to have a conversation coming at our different perspectives from all over the world. And also, as we talk on this podcast about youth engagement, youth empowerment, youth activism, what does that mean for us as a movement? Because, we can't really avoid it, I don't think. How is it affecting you both and your activism at the moment?
I think, from my end, it's definitely taking up a lot of room in our heads and also in our work, like redirecting a lot of local community, like volunteering, NGOs, maybe community groups and like grassroots groups that weren't originally dedicated to Palestine necessarily have all, I think, pivoted, like sensing the urgency of the situation. So I think in like one sentence, that's how it's affected my community and like what I see. And then for those who weren't initially a part of that too, like a lot of messaging geared to try to appeal to different groups of people. So just like not focusing on, for example, like the sheer number of killings, but also that this is an ecocide, that the entire like ecosystem, the biodiversity, the nature in Palestine is also just being exterminated. And so connecting it to different causes, I think, was how it initially first started popping up. I don't know about you, Lucy.
Yeah, I think for me, when was it 7th of October 2023 when the big, not the big killings because killings already happened before that decades ago, but when it really hit like media spotlight, I was actually doing my MA International Child Rights and Child Development, which made it, I would say, like even more like it was an actual case study we were looking into, and also the ineffectiveness of the UN and the laws and the conventions, and even if you ratify it, there's nothing that puts you like in terms of accountability or whatever actions you're doing to certain populations in the world. And I think Israel-Palestine is a perfect example, unfortunately, of the sort of like laws that are not being abided, and especially doing a MA International Child Rights and seeing the amount of children that have been killed since 7th of October, but again also before. And it's not just being killed by Israeli, it's also a whole health crisis with like famine, not them having enough resources to basically live. So it's an open air prison. That's how I would react to it. They're trapped in it, and I think the world is quite looking at it, but without any actions towards it. And it's very infuriating as a young person yourself to see this during the time where activism has taken a step forward in terms of making things right. These kinds of battles with like Israel and Palestine is something that is very recurrent for any activist, I think, around the world, and not just specifically in the Middle East or Europe, which are closer. I think it's a human right, child right, to just have a peaceful life, basically, which is not the case that Palestine is having, and either for Israeli people that are not okay with that situation in Palestine, but also have the consequences of them also having bombardments, but not as mediatized as Palestine. Um, some people in Israel are not against what the government is actually doing. I think sometimes you need to separate both, and not just do a generalization about Israel. But on paper, it is quite awful to see, and especially me having a whole career with children and young people, is just unbearable sometimes to just um, open the TV, like just turning on the TV and seeing, oh, another bombardment, oh, another killing, another inaction from the UN, another inaction from Europe, or that country allowing Netanyahu to come in their borders or things like that, when he's actually like, he's the equivalent of Hitler in modern times, for me personally.
Mm. Yeah, I really feel all of that. I think for me, I mean, I struggle to find the words at this point. I think there's no words to quite describe what's happening, but I think how, you know, from a local perspective here in the UK, I mean, I speak for myself. I don't think I really was aware of what was going on in Palestine until, well, a couple of years ago when, the kind of genocide was amplified. And yeah, I feel a lot of guilt around that. And I think, yeah, it's interesting when you say like young people, like our connection to it, because I think, we say that this genocide in Palestine is, the most well documented genocide in like history, right? Because we're seeing it live streamed on our feeds. And I think that's when we're really seeing a new movement of young people come into the forefront in like amplifying, this injustice. But yeah, yeah, I feel like I can't talk about anything without talking about Palestine, like right now. Like when we talk about kind of climate activism, that's something I talk about a lot. I'm involved in here in the southwest of England. And I feel like we can't talk about the climate crisis at the moment without talking about Palestine. Like we're talking about, obviously Greta Thunberg is a big spokesperson at the moment. We've just seen her on third time trying to break the siege in Gaza with the Global Smooth Flotilla. And, she's obviously an icon of the climate movement in the West. And, she articulates so beautifully how the intersectionality between kind of climate justice and the liberation of the Palestinian people. And it just boils down to, obviously, you mentioned, Annabelle, like there is an ecocide happening, but also it's humans, it's people. Like at the end of the day, it's children that are having their lives taken. A classroom of children is killed every day, I think it is. And it's like, Yeah, to me, I think it's crazy. I do find myself in many rooms still of people that are still unaware. And I try to have a lot of empathy for kind of my comrades because I felt like I wasn't really aware of the situation until October the 7th myself. I'd probably been to maybe at one, I think I went to one march around the occupation of Palestine before then in London. But up until that point, I wasn't aware, and it wasn't until like this amped up kind of live streaming of genocide that I kind of became more educated on the occupation of Palestine for the last 75 years, and what's going on now. And but yeah, I feel like it's really interesting to see the different movements coming together. And yeah, I do try to have empathy for my comrades that don't really feel like at the same place, because I do think it's interesting because you have, when we talk about young people and youth movements, I feel like we have the people that are really engaged, through like this media revolution. And but then I feel like, in classrooms, in boardrooms, Palestine is still such a taboo topic. It's still, in many spaces, particularly in the UK right now, it's being criminalized to, show a support of a certain
Hmm.
group that's acting towards Palestine, but also speaking out against the genocide of Palestine is criminalized. And there's a lack of education, and there's a lack of just awareness of the occupation of Palestinian people. And I feel that from a local perspective to share here, that feels really frustrating. And it's just really distressing. But I do find a lot of hope in people like, the humanitarian aid activists on the global SMID flotilla who are kind of spreading this message far and wide. And yeah, I do feel hope in that movement, because I do think we're rising up in our thousands and our millions. It's just we're not seeing that in traditional media sense. I think we see it in our own kind of media revolution. Like I say, I think young people are taking to TikTok or taking to Instagram, and we do see it, but it feels like we don't, because of the media, at least. I feel like here in the UK, I don't know, you can speak where you're from, Annabelle, but it's not. It's the media is, cracking, highlighting the criminalization of
Hmm.
these movements.
For
Yeah,
sure.
I wonder if that's a similar experience
Yeah,
for you.
I would say even if the criminalization isn't happening on the same scale here, it really just is like the suppression in media. And I guess just like a targeted effort to make it seem like our message isn't getting out or it's not being amplified and that sort of thing. But going back to your point on raising awareness, I think that's where a lot of young people see their role in not just this movement, but in a lot of movements or humanitarian crises or genocides and that sort of thing is raising awareness. And it's come to a point where, it's been um, 2 years essentially since October 7th, 2023. And myself and a lot of other young people that I know at least are thinking about to what extent does raising awareness matter, right? Like if it's been 2 years since this started gaining more and more media attention, um, everybody who cares, like who would, be empathetic enough or care enough about this genocide would probably already be involved in it by now. And so, like, should our role shift? And so, for me personally, I think um, thinking about like whether, a lot of youth here care about Palestine, that doesn't really like that sounds really negative to say, but it doesn't really impact like a Palestinian family displaced in Gaza, right? If there aren't any like dollars actually moving towards them and there isn't actually like physical supplies moving to them. And so I think it's really hard because a lot of young people, whether we're like students or new grads, like looking for work, oftentimes not very like high or stable income either. Um, it's hard to see a like capacity beyond raising awareness. And yeah, I don't know. That can be quite depressing for me to think about sometimes. I don't know if that resonates with either of you.
I feel like can't remember when it was. I think it was a few weeks ago. There was the UN summit in New York, and Netanyahu did a speech, and I want to say a good half of the assembly walked off, ending
Mm.
this speech, and I was like, for the first time, it took them 2 years, but for the first time, they actually like did a sort of silent protest and just went out of the room without well, without saying anything. But just the fact of doing that is also proving that maybe we're slowly coming to international stage. I think it gives a bit of hope that maybe things are going to change, but in a way of like it is tr I do resonate with what Annabelle said, in terms of like young people making this subject like aware globally in their home countries, in their local communities and things like that. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, it is like the big powers that are able to take those decisions or maybe to stop that kind of very raw and very long war between Israel and Palestine. Like Tash mentioned, the 75 years. It started with the UN and the UK actually in the 1950s, doing that separation of that territory at the time. So I feel like we need to put pressure on politicians, international organizations, in order to have a certain benefit of it. And feel like we're maybe coming to a slow start in it, which is finally maybe happening after 2 years. But in the sense of like media coverage, I vividly remember when 7th October happened, the BBC just covered Israel. Um,
Mm.
it was just an Israeli side of thing. It was never talking about Palestine. It was how Hamas was affecting Israel. And then it slowly come to terms with like the whole Palestine action, Palestine protests and things like that, and starting to slowly maybe a bit show both of the sides. But still like I think there was a sports journalist that stand up to Palestine. I think it's Gary Lineker, but I could be wrong. That got he got axed from BBC because of his stand for Palestine, and he was very vocal afterwards regarding that, and also regarding sports and how it's affected the Palestine team, whether it's women's or men. I do remember vividly. I think it was for the World Cup. Olympics, I can't remember. Um, but they did the advert of showing all the 23 players that would qualify for Palestinian men's football, and it was in a refugee camp in Gaza, and they'd put all the photos of all the players with a background of what was actually happening in Gaza at the time. And I found it very vivid that things like that are being put up front and not like being very honest about the truth. I think it slowly came to life what was actually happening, whereas the media was probably protecting that sort of image and making sure that Israel was really good looking in a way. And it wasn't their fault, it was Hamas, it was Palestine, whether I think it's a war in between Israeli government and Hamas, and then you've got the population in each country, Palestinians, you want to help them to have peace globally, and also them having their territory. I should remember this, but can't remember what they say. Is it land to sea, sea to land? Can't remember. Bring back your land. Can't remember what it was, but it's a centers to rehab the territory of Palestine being recognized. And I feel like it's become such a global movement for young people to actually put the word out there, putting pressure on people,
Yeah.
doing activism against Israel, against the government, against Netanyahu, making sure that Palestine is recognized as a country as well. The fact it's already not been recognized by a country like decades ago is quite baffling to me. But we're slowly coming to a start of maybe something that could happen for Palestine with like countries in Europe recognizing the state. South America, I think Colombia was one of the first ones to recognize Palestine, and those small things do mean a lot. But I think as young people and as a planet globally, we like for things to go quicker. And I think in
Yeah.
this situation, I think things should go quicker because the more you wait, the more children, Palestinian young people, families in the Gaza Strip are going to die. And that's on at the end of the day, that's the truth reality. So the longer you take, the more families will be killed, unfortunately.
Yeah, definitely. And I completely agree with your thinking about like, you know, the world needs to act in the powers that be and things around like the UK's power. Like if the UK and US government want to stop this genocide, they would have done so 2 years ago, and I'm a full believer of that. But yeah, but back to our power as young people, I think, yeah, completely like I've seen that kind of feeling that agency in terms of raising awareness, like you say, and we see, I think yeah, we've seen that movement of young people, like saying this kind of. I do think it's been a bit of like a media revolution, honestly. Like we've seen, young people in Gaza live streaming the genocide, but then you've also seen young people across the globe amplifying it through social media and through different means, and yeah, but also just raising awareness in different ways too. And I think, I mean, I feel like I've tried to do that personally. We're being at this stage in our lives, like you say, being students, being new grads, things like that. It's definitely been such a yeah, being at such an early stage in my career, going into different jobs and things, and I'm going to stand for Palestine. I'm going to try and raise awareness for it however I can. I don't want to work for an organization that's funding genocide in any way. It's silencing the Palestinian people in any way. And I feel like feels like quite a big stance throughout Gen Z, which feels quite powerful in terms of just like the boycott and divestment movement. I think we've really tapped into that. But also just like, I think we talk about on this podcast being an imperfect activist, like, having to grow up and just like face the trials of just like trying to get work and just trying to live and stuff is like hard enough in itself, but then adding activism on top of that and like all the things that are going on in the world is quite hard. And I feel like I've kind of had direct experience with that around like speaking up for Palestine, like within the workplace and like my early career. I was working for an organization straight out of university, and that was the time when kind of this genocide was escalating. October the 7th happened, and I found myself, obviously trying to voice kind of my views and stand up for Palestine, and encouraged this organization I work for to do that too, because were a really I was really proud to work for them because they had previously hung the Ukrainian flag outside their offices during Putin's invasion of Ukraine and things like that. So I was voicing for us to do something similar when we first kind of saw the escalation of the genocide in Palestine. And yeah, I found myself being really shot down. I was the youngest person in that organization, and I felt like I kind of had the world on my shoulders, and I had a big responsibility to be that voice for the young people of Palestine, but to be that kind of voice of change. And yeah, no, I mean, I found myself, being shot down, and I was told that the Palestinian badge that I was wearing to the office was making my older colleagues, uncomfortable, and they weren't willing to listen to me. Or yeah, I mean, fortunately, I don't work for them anymore, but it was a really interesting experience to be like, actually, I now work for an organization that's really aligned with my views, and really, I work for an NGO now. But I think that's so interesting from our generation. We're really seeing that kind of like, I feel adamant now that I won't work for an organization that is kind of, taking that stance towards Palestine, no matter if, yeah, it's now or if it's how many ever years in the future, wherever, we are with the genocide. I think that's something that's really important to me. And like I say, I think young people are really tapping into that kind of taking action in terms of like the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and just in their choices of how they choose to live. We're at the early stages of our career. We have a lot of power there, and we also have a lot of power in our voices in terms of holding power and people in power to account in that way. Yeah, I don't know if you've had any similar experiences. Um,
Yeah, I definitely don't have. I mean, I've always worked in NGOs, and because my job is remote, there's nothing as blatant as, like wearing like a scarf or wearing a pin that like visually demonstrates your support for Palestine or like other movements and that sort of thing, but definitely just like I think I've definitely sensed discomfort or like skirting around the topic, um, trying to quote unquote stay neutral, and that sort of thing in a lot of conversations. But I think um, really leaning into community and organizing with people who can amplify your efforts, like you can collectively scale up your efforts, and at this point in time, like not trying to continue to convince other people who have, seen this going on for so long and still haven't voiced support, still haven't joined in, is more productive. So, for example, like maybe 1 or 2 months ago, me and a couple of my friends who are quite involved in just like the local community organizing, um, seeing and not necessarily organizing. We're all very climate focused and like culture focused, but we
Mm.
did a little community fundraiser. For two Palestinian families. And I think that was re a really beautiful example of um, not necessarily like shutting out the rest of the world or shutting out the rest of society, but really relying on folks we already know are very committed and passionate about this and kind of like giving them an avenue to support it further. So it was kind of just like a brunch event that was a fundraiser and that was an opportunity for people to get together, but also for them to, I guess, like give funds if they were able to. So I think as a youth organizer in this time or as a youth activist, it's really important to be able to lean into your community, and that allows you to like scale up your efforts and like amplify your efforts as opposed to you organizing alone in like Tash, like in a company where everybody is kind of uninvolved or against your support.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, I had so in my current work, I resonate with Annabelle say on like being neutral, because in my current work, because it's UK led, we need to be apolitical, which sometimes I'm like, you can't really be apolitical in this time and day. And that does also relate to like the Palestinian flag and us maybe like bringing a pin at work. At some point, we were told that we couldn't take a pin at work because it's not apolitical and you have to be neutral in this kind of places. Now they're a bit better about it. But I do remember when I was studying my MA, it was at King's College London, and a few weeks after the 7th of October, everyone, so staff and student, received a letter saying that basically, if you were doing anything for Palestine, whether it was wearing a pin, the scarf, going to a protest, doing a fundraise, whatever, you will be out of King's. So it was basically a threat of if you are for Palestine, you'll get stripped of a job. You will not be a student anymore in that MA. And a lot of people took it very personally and very much like a threat to the overall educational system. And especially given the fact that I was personally in the education and child development section of King's, those it's even deeper, I would say, having received that, because it goes against all our values and what we're actually studying for. Um, but other than that, I've not had any like personal experience myself of having someone just being like, um, oh, you shouldn't wear that pin or something like that. I've actually had a experience when I did wear a pin and one of the women came near me at first, and I was like, that was my first thinking was like, oh no, she's going to tell me to take it off or something like that. And she said to me, thank you. And I found it like really like powerful of like just wearing a pin. People, this old woman was really happy about it and just said like that's already making it an awareness and showing your support in a silent way and not in an actionable way. But I feel like having Palestinian flags a bit everywhere in order for also people not to forget, because if you're not an activist, you can slowly forget things because it's not always in the media. Sometimes it's just over and over again on the media, and some people just are fed up of seeing maybe like the lows in the world and things like that. And I think it's quite important to show that there's still support being given to Palestine, whether it's local communities or in universities, national level or parliament. But I still think like in terms of protests in the UK, we're quite bad at it. In terms of the government having put Palestine as a terrorist organization or terrorism themselves, everyone that protests for Palestine does risk to be put in handcuffs. And it's just not normal because that's freedom of speech at the end of the day. You allowed, what was it, 2 weeks ago, the Tommy Robinson protests, no one got arrested. But if you do a Palestinian protest, you're quite likely to get arrested. I mean, there's like a few people, like even an old veteran in a wheelchair got arrested, and I was like, what is he gonna do? Like, he's like most people that go to Palestinian protests in London are probably very peaceful and just voice their opinion, and at the end of the day, it's freedom of speech. And I don't think the UK on that is very freedom of speech. Comparing
Yeah.
to Belgium, in Belgium we do have protests for Palestine. But because it's in Brussels, we're protected by European law in terms of like freedom of speech. You can't get attacked for whatever protest you can do in Brussels. So I don't think people have been arrested, but in other cities they have, um, because they will make an excuse of why they should arrest these people, whether in the UK it's terrorism, whether in Belgium it is because of the colour of their skin.
Mhm.
Mm.
So I feel like there's a sort of
Yeah.
underlying issue of like freedom of speech overall in this issue, and for people to give their opinion, whether it's through protesting, through social media, through damaging Israeli properties, which I'm not a fan of, but at the end of the day, you're just lighting the fire even more for activism, and sometimes these are the consequences, and
Yeah.
it should be done in like less violence as possible, but sometimes you need a big reaction in order to have maybe an outcome.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's how I feel
I
about.
think I just keep thinking, you just said something a moment ago, Lucy, about just like the UK, particularly its reaction to people kind of voicing, standing up for Palestine, and you said it's just not normal. And I'm just like, yeah, like it's just not normal. I'm sorry, none of this is normal. And the way we're treating people wearing pins, treating people going to a protest is not normal. Not and what else is not normal is people yes no. um people not voicing and standing up for Palestine. Like, it's not normal what's going on. The amount of children being killed is not normal. There's a lot of things like, and that just drives me mad, honestly. Like, it feels so simple to me. But what you're saying also about community, Annabelle, I was just like nodding. I was like, yeah, I think community is so important, and it's so important to show up. I feel like, no matter what, I've found a lot of comfort in like locally. We have little demos in our like local town square every Saturday, and vigils every Wednesday evening. I just found so much comfort in like finding community. Intergenerationally, I think, actually, like for me personally, it's been such a like, yeah, so wonderful. And just that power in showing up, I think, honestly, even though it feels like we can't do anything and it's so overwhelming, and these big, the governments need to be acting and doing something, like, oh my god, like, showing up just feels really like something we can all do. Like, we can all show up, and that there can be many senses of that word. You can show up in different ways, doing different things. But I think something that young people can do is show up.
We'll be releasing episodes every other Friday, and you can get them wherever you get your podcast, through the Be the Change Media Network. You can also find us on Instagram at theimperfectactivist.podcast and on LinkedIn. Be sure to check out all the other amazing podcasts by young people on the Be the Change Media Network. Until next time, bye!
We don't need 100 perfect activists, but millions of imperfect ones.
Young people, we're the future, we've got everything to fight for.